Hello and welcome to this Missouri Department of Mental Health e-learning training program called Rethinking Guardianship. My name is Tom Pansella with the Missouri Institute of Mental Health. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Also joining us is Nancy Nicholas, who obtained her master's in social work from the University of Missouri. She began working with individuals with disabilities as a direct support worker in the early 1980s. Nancy worked as a service coordinator with individuals with mental illness for 11 years. In 1994, she began her work at the Department of Mental Health, Division of Developmental Disabilities. She has experience working in the division's federal programs unit with home and community-based waivers, self-directed services, targeted case management programs, and many other division initiatives. Nancy is currently a member of the division's Transformation Initiative, promoting the goal of community living for individuals with disabilities who have long-term care needs. And Nancy, thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with the big question. Why this topic?
Well, first of all, we think that the topic of guardianship is one that interests many, many people. And today I'm not really here to talk about the legal process of obtaining a guardian. Rather, I'm here to talk about what issues should be considered if you're thinking about pursuing a guardianship for someone, and also the importance of looking at other alternatives instead of guardianship.
So how would you define guardianship?
Well, guardianship is a legal process whereby the courts appoint an individual to assist a person with a disability who has been declared incapacitated or incompetent in all areas of their life: financial areas, daily living areas, healthcare areas, and things of that sort. The issue, of course, is that when a guardian is appointed for someone, that individual loses the rights that a lot of us have and take for granted, some of those rights that really define us as human beings. So individuals who have guardians lose the right to vote, or to enter into a contract like purchasing a home or a car, to live where they want and with whom they want. And so we feel as a division that guardianship is really the last recourse that we should take if someone needs increased supports in the community.
Who do you see this particular training program being targeted to?
I really would like to reach out to family members and direct support staff who work with individuals, service coordinators, and other staff who may be assisting families in making a decision whether or not to pursue guardianship. And also for individuals with disabilities as well, because I'd like them to know what alternatives may be available to them in case someone approaches them about this issue.
So, when you get to the point of guardianships, what steps are taken to make sure that the guardianship is in the best interests of that individual?
Well, I think really that it really begins with the person-centered planning process. And when I mean the person-centered planning process, I'm not really talking about the systems plan, because anyone supported by our division and department have a plan in place that is a requirement of whatever service system that they're involved with. What I'm talking about is a true person-centered plan, and let me tell you a little bit about what the differences there is and why it's important that we talk about person-centered planning rather than systems planning. Person-centered planning really has, at its very base, at its foundation, that we will assist an individual to lead a self-determined life. And what I mean by self-determined is that individuals will have the freedom to make choices about their lives. They will have opportunities to take control of their finances and the services that they will use. They'll have a recognition about what responsibilities go along with making the choices that they make. All of this is done with support staff or with supports from family members and friends and people who know and care about them. Last of all, there's a understanding that the person with disabilities will also be involved in helping to shape the service delivery system so that it makes sense for them. Person-centered planning really has at its root the fact that the individual is at the center, and there's a group of people that really care about that person that gathers around the person to help that person get the life that they want. this is very different from a systems plan or from a typical planning process where the individual is there and really the other people there are the professionals that support that person. Because in a person-centered planning process, the person determines who is there. And the best plans that I have seen are the plans that include the person's clergyman, their aunts and uncles, their best friend from school, all of those people who've lived with that person and gotten to know that person so intimately that they can really think out of the box and help problem solve. So I think the first thing we need to do is to make sure that what we're doing is real person-centered planning. And we're bringing those people together that know the person well. I think the other thing about person-centered planning is looking at the goals that the individual has for themselves and then determining what barriers may be put in place to help to prevent that person from achieving those goals. And then the strategizing comes in as how you break down those barriers. Some people think that person-centered planning doesn't address critical issues for the person, and in fact, it's quite the opposite. Person-centered planning talks about what's best, not only important to the person, but also what's important for the person, which is something I think that people don't really understand all the time. So the other thing that person-centered planning can do is provide a process by which you look at what the person wants to do, the associated risks involved in what the person wants to do, and then how you can put safety measures in place, not to eliminate the risk, because all of us have risk in our lives, but to reduce that risk to a manageable level.
Well, let's break this down as it relates to the guardianship process and rethinking guardianship. What are some of the alternatives that people should consider?
Well, I think that everyone working with individuals with disabilities recognize that people have to be healthy and safe. The question is can we keep the person healthy and safe and still support them in maintaining choice and control over their lives? And there are lots of different things, I think, alternatives that we can consider first prior to considering full guardianship. And let me give you an example. There is an individual that I used to work with. Her name was Debbie, and Debbie had a cognitive disability. Debbie also had a bipolar disorder. And when Debbie became symptomatic, she would go out and she would get on QVC and on the home shopping networks, and she would spend. Debbie would also write checks and bounce checks and got into some legal trouble with that behavior. And so Debbie's sister decided that perhaps she wanted to pursue guardianship. And Debbie and her sister went to speak with the support staff at the ISL that was supporting Debbie. And one of the support staff there knew Debbie really, really well and said, hold up, we need to think about something. Isn't it true that if you get a guardian, you're not able to vote? And everybody said, well, yes. And she said, you know, one of the most important things in Debbie's life is the electoral process. Debbie loves to be involved when there's an election. She volunteers for her favorite candidates. She has never missed voting. This is critical to who Debbie is. And so let's try to think of some different ways that we can support Debbie through this behavior, reduce the risk so that we don't have to go this route. And they put several things in place. The first thing that they put in place, and again, this was all decided through a person-centered plan. The first thing they put in place was direct pay, direct bill. And so as her rent became due and all her utilities became due, all of that was immediately withdrawn from her bank account and paid through a direct pay means. The second thing that they did was a dual signature checking account. And so Debbie continued to maintain a checking account, but her sister had to co-sign her checks for her. So she wasn't able to go out and spend when she didn't have funds in her account. A third thing they did, and I thought this was very clever, is that Debbie loves credit cards. And so each month her sister goes and buys Visa debit cards. And every week when she meets with Debbie for Sunday church, she gives Debbie her Visa debit card. And it has a set amount on it. And Debbie knows that when that Visa debit card is empty, it's empty. And a debit card is something you can't overspend. Then the last thing that they did is they sat down as a planning team and they said, when do we know that Debbie's starting to decompensate? What are the little triggers that we see? And they made a list of those. And then they started strategizing, what can we do when we see these start happening? And the most important thing they did was ask Debbie, when you start not being able to sleep, when you start not reading your Bible as frequently as you typically do, how can we help you and how can we support you so that maybe you don't go into a full-blown episode? And did it reduce the risk totally? No, of course not. Again, all of us have risk in our life. But what it did do was reduce that risk to a manageable level so that guardianship did not have to be pursued. And the sister was comfortable in her belief that Debbie would be safe and healthy and happy and continue to pursue the life she wanted to pursue.
That's great. So that covers kind of some of the financial stuff, and if somebody's having difficulties at that level, are there any other alternatives that people should look at?
There are other alternatives. You know, anyone who receives Social Security can have a representative payee assigned to them, and that can be helpful in some cases. And in other cases, parents who have had children and who are concerned with what will happen to their children after they perhaps pass on have had trusts that have been set up for their children. I know an individual who has set up a trust for their son. Their son has some really serious alcohol and drug issues. And the father was very concerned when he passed away that if there was a lump sum given to Sam, that Sam would spend them in ways that he shouldn't, and it would be felt very self-destructive. And so he set up a trust for Sam. He manages to pay Sam's bills. Sam is an individual with multiple disabilities. Manages to pay Sam's bills from the trust each month, and also sets aside spending money. And in the trust as well, there is leeway for larger purchases that Sam might need at future times. And so that's a way that the family could also protect his benefits. And all of these, most of these or some of these, if you're interested in them, you should pursue them by talking to an attorney, finding out what your options are, and having that a attorney support you through these processes.
Well, I've heard of conservatorships. What can you tell us about those?
Well, conservatorship is another way to assist an individual with managing their finances. When a conservator is appointed by the court, that conservator assists the individual with finances but leaves the person free to make other choices in their life, like where they live and who they live with, where they work, and things of that sort. So it is less intrusive than guardianship. There is also a possibility to have limited conservatorships so that individuals perhaps don't have to have all of their funding under the conservatorship. So it's just another less intrusive option for people.
And that covers the financial issues pretty well. Are there other support needs that people may have that tend to lead people down the path towards guardianship?
Well, sure. I think sometimes individuals may have some behavioral issues that cause concern for people. And again, I get back to that person-centered planning process. You know, sometimes we think we know what the problem is, but really we don't. And what we see as the problem is really a symptom of the problem. And let me give you an example. There was an individual that lived in an ISL, and it seemed like in a short amount of time, he went from being a person who was happy and seemed content with his life to someone who was having some pretty serious behavior problems. He was knocking holes in walls. He was kicking out at his staff. He didn't communicate with words, which complicated the situation because staff really didn't know how to communicate with him and really find out what was going on with him. This resulted in a couple of hospitalizations and return to the institution. And finally, one of his service coordinators, and I say one of his service coordinators because during this time service coordination had changed from one individual to the other, but his old service coordinator said, you know, let's get together. Something has changed. This isn't the way that Paul really is. So we need to figure out what's changed in his life. And they pulled together a group of individuals and they started looking at things and they found out a couple of things. The first thing they found out was that the ISL had been sold to another provider agency. So another provider agency had taken over and the staff had totally flipped in that home and there was new staff in the home. The second thing that they found out is certain rituals that Paul had that was very, very important to him. Rituals like when he was able to relax after work, taking a shower and what time he took a shower, watching a certain TV program at a certain time, were no longer part of his routine. And what Paul, they felt, was trying to communicate was, you changed my routine, you took away my choice, you took away my control, and by the way, you did it really quickly and nobody warned me it was coming. And there's all of these new people in my home. The people before knew how I communicated and were able to communicate with me. So where initially they said, oh, the problem is Paul and Paul's behavior, they came to see very quickly that really the problem was that Paul's routine has been changed and his environment had been changed. And so they had been in a place where they were considering guardianship because Paul wasn't really cooperating with the healthcare decisions that people were making with him regarding his behaviors, to changing his environment back to really what it was before so that his rituals were respected. And within a couple of weeks, his behavior just kind of, those behaviors that were the problem just sort of disappeared, and Paul was able to go back to living his life the way he wanted.
What about healthcare issues?
I think healthcare issues, particularly for individuals with developmental disabilities, really are frequently a cause for concern. And I do know that hospitals and healthcare professionals are concerned about people making the right decisions for themselves. Not that you and I always make the right healthcare decisions for ourselves, but really having enough information and understanding the information to be informed about the choices that they make. There was an example of John who was perfectly capable of caring for himself in his home, handling small amounts of money, cooking microwaved meals, but he began to have some health problems. And when they took him to the hospital to be considered for surgery, because his general practitioner felt that he needed surgery, the hospital said, we're concerned, we don't feel that he is competent enough to give consent for this surgery, so maybe you need to go and find John a guardian. Well, instead, someone who knew what they were doing was there and suggested, rather than a guardian, that there be a healthcare power of attorney appointed for John. John didn't have a lot of family, but John did have a friend, Richard, who was in his life for 25 years. He'd known him since high school, and staff approached Richard, and Richard agreed to undertake and act as an agent on John's behalf. And so John maintains all of the rights that you and I have as far as voting and driving and things of that sort, but Richard really helps John take care of his health care needs. So that's one option.
Let's talk a little bit about the division's approach? How does the Department of Mental Health, Division of Developmental Disabilities approach the topic, the notion of guardianship?
Well, you know, as I said earlier, the Division of Developmental Disability really are one of our main values, and the foundation of what we do is to help people lead self-determined lives. And that is sort of in direct contradiction to guardianship, because if we say we want people to be in charge of their services and supports, make choices about who supports them, take control of their life and their money in a responsible way, then to have a guardianship appointed for the individual and relinquish all those choices, those things are kind of contradictory. Not that in some very, very rare instances it doesn't need to happen, but for the most part, what we would like to see is alternatives to guardianship being considered so that people can lead self-determined lives.
And once somebody has a guardian appointed or is in a guardianship, is that ever modified? Is that ever terminated?
Well, part of the issue with a guardianship, I think, is that it's a legal process, which costs money. You know, it costs money for attorney's fees, for different types of assessments, court fees, and things of that sort. And so when you go to get the guardianship modified, you have to pull back in an attorney, and those costs may be incurred all over again. Interestingly enough, the other thing that Missouri does not pursue is limited guardianships. And there is in statute in Missouri that limited guardianships can be guardians can be appointed. What that means is that guardians can be appointed just to take care of one specific issue in a person's life. For instance, an individual who has a mental illness and refuses medication and hospitalization. But in Missouri, we don't tend, at least at this point, I don't know that we tend to go in that direction. And I was reading some data the other day that said in New Hampshire, 90% of the guardianships that are awarded in New Hampshire are limited guardianships. So that tells me a couple of things. It tells me that, first of all, we have a lot of training to do with staff and with parents about what their alternatives are. And secondly, we have a lot of training to do with the judicial system to make them understand why full guardianship can irreparably harm someone as far as them pursuing the quality of life that they want to live.
I always like to give people a chance to speak directly to our audience, and what would be kind of your philosophical message or your practical hands-on message to our viewers?
Well, I think I would say to them that I want them to remember all of the different passages that they've gone through in life. When they bought their first car, when they got married, when they voted for the first time. Those things really define us as human beings. And when we're talking about pursuing guardianship for people, we are really talking about making those passages of life unavailable to people. And if those things define who we are, they also define who everyone is, really. And so I would ask them to go back to planning, to, if a child is going to be transitioning, start when the child is really young and plan well with that child so that you're not at 18 and everyone's suddenly in a panic trying to figure out what are we going to do with this kid to keep him happy and safe. Plan. Bring the person around that individual who loves that person, who cares about that person. If you don't know how to facilitate a good person-centered plan, ask your service coordinator or someone else that can facilitate a good person-centered plan to step up and do that for you. I think that we need to ask, what are the person's real needs? and make sure that it's not about control. It's not about you controlling the person's life, but what are the real issues, what are the person's real needs, and then address those. And then I think you need to ask yourself does the benefit of having a guardian really outweigh what the person can do in their life if they are in control of making choices for themselves? And then I think the last thing is about risk. And to remember that we can't take away all risk. We want to keep people healthy. We want people to be safe. But all we can do for ourselves, for our kids, for people that we support, is to minimize the risk so that it's manageable. And always, always go back to person-centered planning.
Now, I know you're not dispensing legal advice, but are there some resources that you can kind of hook people up with?
Sure. I would send people to a couple of different places. One place that I would encourage individuals to go is the Missouri Planning Council for Developmental Disability, to their website. And if you just Google Missouri Planning Council, you'll find that address. I would also encourage them to go out to Missouri Protection and Advocacy. There is actually a manual on guardianship and conservatorship on their website, and it's a very good resource. And then last of all is always, if you have any questions, ask an attorney, and they can provide you legal advice.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for taking this training program. To complete the training process, please proceed to the post-test. Thank you for your time.